Well, good afternoon. You're all very welcome to Georgetown University. My name is Gerard Mannion, and I'm part of the Berkley Center for Religion, Peace and World Affairs here, and I also teach in the Department of Theology. But with another hat on, I'm part of a new initiative we're developing at Georgetown for Global Irish Studies. Georgetown as a university was founded in 1789 by an Irish American, John Carroll, the very first Catholic bishop in the United States. The university has been intimately connected to the Irish and in the Irish American community ever since. Many of the Jesuits who have taught and ministered at the university have been Irish, and Irish Americans have generously supported and endowed groundbreaking initiatives on the campus throughout its history. So it seemed only fitting, in fact for many long overdue, that there should be an Irish Studies initiative at Georgetown. And indeed, that is exactly what we've developed over the past few years, led in collaboration with my great colleagues, Irene Gilson here from Nursing and Health Sciences and Colleen Parsons from the Department of English. It's an Irish Studies initiative with a difference, the focus being on global Irish studies, given our location, of course, in the nation's capital, and the rise in Irish developments and questions of global import. The initiative has three core aims: engaging a community, inspiring students, and enabling research. And we've organised a great deal of programs and events in recent times, and today we're very, very delighted to have you here to celebrate the 20th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement and explore questions about the future for the generation of peace. Like many around my age, I can hear your brains calculating now, don't be fooled by the hairline. When I was very young, growing up in an Irish family in the UK, scenes on the television news of what was essentially a battlefield, a war zone, surprised my young mind when I heard reporters say that these scenes were from Ireland. They were more baffling to me still when I learned that the people fighting each other were divided by their religious affiliation. I knew we went to one church and that other churches nearby us were the places where other people, called Protestants or Anglicans, went. I found it hard to understand, though, why people would want to kill each other over what church they went to. But it also seemed that there was something different about the peoples who entered those varying different churches. My father did a very good job at trying to explain what was happening in Northern Ireland, with the aid of some rough diagram maps, a quick history lesson, and a very balanced and objective, not to mention patient, set of explanations. But it's fair to say that it would be hard to find a single day until well over 2.5 decades later when Northern Ireland did not feature on the television screens and in the newspapers. That news was rarely of positive developments. Tales of shootings, bombings, maximum security prisons, hunger strikes, marches, wrongful arrests and imprisonments, assassinations and political intransigence and failings were part of the relentlessly painful tale of a small entity of 6 counties where historic, cultural and religious divisions ran so deep. But it also became increasingly clear that there were many people who wanted the violence to stop and wanted a very different story to develop for everyone in Northern Ireland. Gradually, those people would become the focus of the news stories more and more until their efforts resulted in Northern Ireland ceasing to be news in the way it once so regularly was. The years 1994 and 1998 are etched into the memories of many of us in the story of Northern Ireland because they marked the key moments when those who were working for peace came to the fore and began to succeed. The first Ira Ceasefire was 94, and the Good Friday Agreement, of course, which was signed 20 years ago last Tuesday. And another date is etched into the memory. On Tuesday, the 8th of May in 2007, an event took place which would have been literally unthinkable just a few years beforehand. Staunch Ulster loyalist Ian Paisley of the Democratic Unionist Party and equally staunch Republican Sinn Féin's Martin McGuinness were jointly sworn in as Northern Ireland's First Minister and Deputy First Minister, respectively. Both of these men have now passed away, of course. But that day in 2007 marked a return to devolved government for the communities of Northern Ireland and heralded a genuine new dawn in the relations between the divided peoples and traditions of the 6 counties that constitute Northern Ireland. In his own speech following the ceremony, McGuinness spoke the following words, and I quote, "Ireland's greatest living poet, a fellow Derry man, Seamus Heaney, once told a gathering I attended at Magee University that for too long and too often we speak of the others or of the other side and that what we need to do is get to a place of through otherness. The office of the First and Deputy First Ministers is a good place to start. This will only work if we collectively accept the wisdom and importance of Seamus Heaney's words. Much work has been done, which has confounded critics and astounded the sceptics. We must overcome the difficulties which we face in order to achieve our goals and seize the opportunities that exist. This and future generations expect and deserve no less from us. Heaney, in that talk, had most likely been drawing upon a previous address he'd given at Aberdeen in 2001, where he cites the poem called Armagh by the sometime Presbyterian minister, BBC producer, and poet W.R. Rogers, who was known affectionately as the Catholic Presbyterian because of his non-sectarian demeanour. The phrase through otherness comes from Rogers' poem itself, to quote, "There is a through otherness about Armagh, of tower and steeple. Upon the hill are the arguing graves of the kings, and below are the people." Heaney spoke of Rogers' own personal background and how it embraced Irish, Scots, and English heritage in much the same way as those three cultural identities have shaped Northern Ireland for much of its history. Indeed, I think Martin McGuinness's words from that day in 2007 and the long conflict that has plagued Ireland perhaps offer us the chance to reflect upon the destructive forces unleashed when we accentuate otherness in negative and pejorative ways. And so does Martin McGuinness's speech allow us to see that we can choose also to affirm, celebrate, and embrace otherness and to move through it to a better place. So April 98 and May 2007, even to those from far beyond the island of Ireland, the momentousness of those events can hopefully be appreciated. But the sight of Ian Paisley and Martin McGuinness side by side, sharing jokes with the media and discussing the shared positive future they both hope to facilitate for their respective communities, which together form one community, was something many would once have deemed to be literally impossible. And yet, Martin McGuinness's appropriation of Seamus Heaney and W.R. Rogers helps us understand how in our times there is also still too much talk of the otherness of the other. Pejorative otherness has returned with a particularly harsh edge in recent years. Commonality and shared humanity are less to the fore today than in many quarters they were before. Divisions, deficiencies, and disagreements preoccupy far too much energy and time. Such might well be symptoms of the increasingly divided world we live in, but they are also causal factors that further contribute to the divisions that ravage the human family today. And in general, one could say otherness in the 21st century has become not less, but rather more accentuated. Entire faiths and cultures are perceived to be pitted against one another in the minds of some. Conflicts rage, which define the opposition through their very cultural and religious and ethnic otherness. Human rights are breached, and the accords of international law are ignored, because certain states believe that the other deserves less rights and dignity than those who share more sameness with ourselves. Well, today we're going to explore some of these themes and some of the history. We have a wonderful lineup of speakers for you, and we are especially grateful that to begin our proceedings, we will have one of the people without whom the peace process would just not have been possible, Bruce Morrison. To introduce Bruce Morrison, I ask my colleague, Drew Christensen, to come and join us, please.
Me too. Good, Ben. You go up there. Thanks. Oh, wait a minute. Okay. There. All right. Thank you for waiting. I'm delighted to be with you today. This is a great book, Penn's book, Peacerunners, and the great hero, Bruce Morrison, who I'm glad to meet for the first time. His part of the story is not one that I knew. At the Bishops' Conference, where I really got involved with Northern Ireland more than 20 years ago, we found this an issue we couldn't get into because the Irish bishops wouldn't agree to the U.S. bishops intervening in their business. It was our policy. Bishops' Conference only advocated with the corresponding bishops' conference said yes. And the late Bishop Edward Daly of Derry said to John Carr, he said, you know, there are 34 bishops, there are 34 shades of green. So there was no agreement on our getting involved until Cathal Daly became the Archbishop of Armagh. And then he called us and said, listen, I'd like to do business. And from then on, we worked as much for him as we did for our own bishops for the next several years. I'd like to introduce Bruce Morrison, who is the hero of this book, although there are lots of other minor figures playing a part. It's the backstory of what led up to the U.S. Envoy being appointed, Senator Mitchell. And Bruce, who did 4 terms in Congress, found himself free in the early 90s and joined up with a group of other Irish Americans, friends of Northern Ireland, and began to support a proposal to see that there be an envoy and that the U.S. give a visa to Jerry Adams to come to the U.S. And Penn's book is a splendid book. As a former editor, I best like to do book reviews, and I'd love to give a book review to this because it's just a splendid read, especially from the point of view of negotiations. I tell you, if you really want to know what it's like, this is the book to read. It's full of surprises, disappointments, and the little touches that really make things work, in particular the personal chemistry between people. Bruce's intimate knowledge of the Clintons, having gone to law school with them. Bruce walking with Gene Kennedy Smith in a rugby field. There was a walk in the woods in Vienna. In Cambridge, there's a walk across the rugby field. Another time when you go with John Bruton shopping. And one of my rules for negotiation is make sure that you do it, you have informal time to be together. That's where the chemistry really takes place. Penn is now, from lawyering, is becoming a full-time author. He has served as a reporter and a high school teacher before studying law, and then did public interest law for a while before practicing law in New Haven. And we all have roots in New Haven in one way or another. Theirs much deeper than mine, but I still look back fondly to my days there. So I'm very happy to invite you. I have 2 really vivid memories of Northern Ireland and the Good Friday Agreement. The first takes place in Belfast. We were on, I think, our first meeting with the Interchurch Committee, which was the group we had with the Presbyterians and Catholics in the U.S., working with the Presbyterians and Catholics in Northern Ireland, later with the Methodists and the Anglicans as well. And we were spending the last day in Derry with Bishop Daly, seeing the reconstruction he had to supervise there. And I was sent off on a bus to go back to the airport and fly back home through Heathrow. And we got on there was road construction, the bus driver got lost. We wound up going down Victoria Street, the main street in Belfast, and all of a sudden we were being boarded by the constabulary. Well, it turns out that there had been 3 bombings between the time we had approached Belfast and the time that we were on Victoria Street, and they thought we had been kidnapped, the whole bus. So they wanted to check that out. Finally, I get to the airport, and I sit in the airport, and the worst bombing of the day takes place in the military wing of the hospital, which we had just passed on the way to our airport, blew up. It was a vivid kind of acquaintance with the uncertainty and the horror of the struggle there. The second is, in 1998, I left my position as Director of Office of International Justice and Peace at the Bishops' Conference. I was in Jerusalem on retreat, but we made an exception to watch the press conference announcing the Good Friday Agreement. And we were all in tears. Palestinian Christians, internationals who are there on retreat, or the pilgrimages, just pilgrimaging for Holy Week, we were all in tears thinking that this could happen in Northern Ireland. And it wasn't happening there in Jerusalem. And this year, I think many of those memories would be quite raw. as we celebrate the 7th anniversary of Israeli independence and 7th anniversary of the Palestinian Nakba, and see the demonstrations still going on at the Gaza border. The accomplishment that Bruce Morrison and his colleagues brought about in the shifts in policy of the Clinton administration really is memorable, and God willing, there'll be someone who'll be able to do that for the Holy Land as well. So it's my job now to let the two main featured speakers introduce themselves a little bit and the book. We'll first ask Penn to comment a little bit about what he was hoping to do with the book. It's really a wonderful book. I really recommend it highly. I told him, even though I have a rule that books that have large block quotes shouldn't be considered seriously, I suspend my rule. His large block quotes are all obviously from recordings of the principals talking about themselves, not only in time, but also their recollections of what they were thinking about and feeling at those times. And it's great to have their voices spread throughout the book. It's a wonderful read. So I urge you to pick up a copy on the way out. Penn.
Thank you. I'm Penn Rhodeen, and I wrote this book you've been hearing about, and that they, to my great pleasure, named this event after. Peacerunner is a word I made up because I was writing about Bruce Morrison's activity in Northern Ireland. He wasn't official. He didn't hold an office. It was all something he was doing privately, and particularly in this country, quite under the radar. But there had to be a word for it, and I came across the word showrunner. I wondered if a showrunner in Hollywood is a good thing or a high thing or a low thing. It's actually a high thing, but the point is that gave me a word to make up for this, and this is what it was. It was running. As I began this story, as I watched what was unfolding, seeing Bruce as I was from time to time in New Haven, he was everywhere. He went everywhere. And he was in Ireland a lot. He was in Belfast a lot. Had a great misadventure with the Royal Ulster Constabulary on his first trip to Ireland, held at gunpoint, a sitting U.S. congressman. And he was at the New York Times explaining why they really wanted to take an editorial position to encourage events that were developing, encourage a peace process. How I came to write the book and what the book is, I'll tell you very briefly. I'll spare you the personal story that is in the afterword of the book, but the upshot is a guy I hadn't seen in 45 years accused me of having promised to write the great American novel. And while I didn't deny it, because you say lots of crazy things in college, I didn't remember. But I have to say it got the wheels turning. And then when Bruce was in New Haven endorsing a young man running for the state legislature in Connecticut who had lived in Belfast, and a friend of my son's on the Board of Aldermen in New Haven, we had dinner after and we were talking, and then out of that emerged my sense, that's the book to write. That's the book that needs writing. I feel very strongly that the Irish peace process and the outcome of that, the Good Friday Agreement, is truly world historical. Small-scale place, yes, although if you extrapolate the numbers as they do in the book, the level of violence was staggering, especially in Belfast, and there were people living in circumstances where they never, ever knew if their kids or their spouses were coming home that day. Anything was possible. So the numbers are not so shocking by today's spectacular death toll numbers from political violence here and there. But if you think about how small it is and you make it, say, New York City size, well, I'll just give you one statistic. If Belfast had been the size of New York City, the death toll in in Belfast, and death toll therefore in New York City, from political violence, still a comparative rarity in this country, over the 30 years of the Troubles, would be 48,000. That is like a 9/11 every other year for 30 years. We know how transformative one 9/11 was for our country. Imagine 15 of them. I can't get there. And so, and a key element in the developing of a process was there was a solid constituency growing in Northern Ireland. We can't live like this. This is not a place we can raise kids. And so that was a big element, I think, in the successful peace process. If I had one wish for Northern Ireland with it today, I mean, they have their political issues to work out, and they're working on that. But it's clear to me that it would be wonderful if ownership would be taken of this astonishingly great accomplishment that was achieved by the people. Now, it is often described as a triumph of diplomacy, and I know I'm with a distinguished faculty member of the Foreign Service School here, but with all due respect, it wasn't diplomats. They played important roles, they helped, as did civil service. It was a triumph of politics. And of course, it was a mess of politics that got them there. And the short answer is I think if you read this book, is you want to end a war, call a politician. And this was politics at its best, and they're the ones who can do it. And in this case, actually did it. And that it doesn't happen a lot in the world, that centuries-old messes like that. And so, yes, they have a long way to go for sure, and there are disappointments along the way, but it's quite an accomplishment. My other note, just two other things to say. One is, the book is not a history. It's not a comprehensive history. I'm not a qualified historian. I wanted to tell a story. And frankly, although I hadn't written a book before, I had done some writing, and I wanted it to have, frankly, some art to it that would befit the amazing accomplishment and the amazing achievements of the people involved. I hope it's worthy, from an artistic point of view, of the great accomplishment, but that's for others to say. But it was a real pleasure to write, and I feel honored to have had this opportunity to tell this story. Bruce Morrison, I'll just say a few words and he will speak for himself, but there may be things he doesn't say. Just important things about that is one is that in his early efforts, he laid down the basic principles of the entire American involvement in Northern Ireland. Talk to everybody, even if somebody calls them terrorists, even if they are terrorists. Talk to everybody, go anywhere. Operate with a big tent, bring everybody into the process. As he's pointed out many times, the British fantasy was that the moderates, they could marginalize the extremists and they could make peace among the moderates, but the problem was the moderates weren't making war. If you wanted to make peace, you bring the fighters in to the process, and that was a great achievement of the American process. Deal straight up, be honest. He got everybody mad at him when he insisted before a trip to Northern Ireland in the early days that he tell the British what they're doing. He's leading the political leader and spokesman for this delegation, and he wanted them to know. And he thought maybe they'd listen. Not likely, but maybe they would. But the point was, it was their sovereignty, whether everybody liked it or not, and you're not going to do well if you sneak around. So it was straightforward. So he told them, and there was there are other elements to what he contributed. I've written them down here, but you don't need me to do that. But the basic principles of American involvement were laid down by Morrison. A great journalist, David McKittrick, a unionist journalist, said we were trying to figure out what his angle was. He didn't hold an office. He wasn't making money with this. He wasn't running for something else. What was in it for him? And these cynical journalists, who in the North had been through an awful lot of bombings, came to reluctantly to the only conclusion they could, which was the word was altruism. That it was just being done for the right reasons to do a right thing. But what David said was it changed everything, that Americans presenting that way. It signaled the American recognition that there would be no meaningful peace unless both sides were accommodated in this new situation. It wasn't going to be good enough for the for the Republicans and Nationalists to prevail, and now the Unionists and Loyalists would be on the bottom rung. That wasn't the future. The future was a shared future, and it had to be a decent place for everybody. And then I think the last thing I'll say about the American initiative, again, that Morrison really brought to the fore, is that it was, there was no American plan. They weren't there to say, do this and ye be knighted and listen to us and all will be well. Instead it was, we will help you work out the right peace process for you, the right solution for you, and then we will support it. But there's not an American plan. There's not a Clinton plan. It's a process that leads to this peaceful solution that you need. This was all new. It was suddenly American politician was showing up who was interested in the Unionist point of view, the Loyalist point of view, and those connections really were vital to accomplishing the peace. So it was an enormous accomplishment. Clinton and Mitchell carried those same principles forward. As David McKittrick said, the Morrison altruism made Clinton's altruism, because there was no major American interest in doing this, no security interest. It made it credible that they were just trying to do the right thing for the right reasons. And of course, George Mitchell's magnificent performance as the one who helped, was the great honest broker. The U.S. became an honest broker, and it started with Bruce Morrison's forays to Northern Ireland.
Thank you, Penn. Bruce, I know the Irish-American audience knows you, but there are a lot of other people who don't know your story, so fill us in on your story.
Well, first of all, it's a pleasure to be here and glad to see all of you with an interest in the celebration of the Good Friday Agreement. And I got involved in this not because of a specific Irish heritage, but because of a commitment to human rights. And as a member of Congress, I couldn't imagine a more fertile ground for pursuing human rights concerns than in Northern Ireland. And it became something I spent a lot of time on, both as a member of Congress and afterwards. Drew generously said I found myself with free time. He forgot to say that I ran for governor of Connecticut and the people of Connecticut picked someone else. I've been prone to say that in a democracy that people have a right to be wrong. More recently, I've wondered whether it should be that wrong. But the fact is that I did have a break in my role as a politician, and I don't know whether I qualified as a politician anymore. But I hope my political skills that I learned in the Congress and in running for Congress, and even in running for governor, were useful in going forward. And I think it really is important in this age of cynicism about politics and politicians that, in fact, politicians are the people who, on our behalf, practice democracy. And if we really believe in democratic values, we can be as critical as we like of the practitioners, but we need the practitioners, and we need to call them to account to do what is needed, but not to dismiss the idea that politics is somehow a dirty word. So I claim the role of politician in this process without shame. I think this occasion, the 20th anniversary, is very important, but we need to be cautious because there's a tendency to, get your patting yourself on the back and doing other things, all of us who had a role to play about what was accomplished. And in fact, what was accomplished was a great thing. And many people contributed at various stages in very important ways. It's not one person's accomplishment by any means. It, in fact, is the triumph of many people doing what they could do when they could do it and seeing it through. But this is, a stop on the way to something that has to be better in the future. And this is also the description of a process that should never have been necessary. Taking a historical view of what Northern Ireland was like is taking a historical view of what so many conflicts are like around the world, and that is divide and rule. The idea of creating, playing to, and exploiting the tribalism that's in our history as human beings, and allowing that to become a vehicle for control and governance, and embedding in a place those divisions in ways that seem like you could never escape them. And certainly, they're not escaped yet. And there's much more to come. But as you look at those situations in the world, I think from Northern Ireland, you should take two things from that experience. One is these things have been caused, and people have been cast into roles. And we look at them, depending on our point of view, in those different roles. And we tend to assign, white hats and black hats, or red shirts and blue shirts, or whatever you like to call it, to that role, and think about what's going on there in those terms. When in fact, what you should think of is that if any of us were cast in either of the roles or the different roles, we'd probably behave in accordance with the way things have been preordained by the people who were in charge at an earlier time. And the second is that these are not hopeless situations. They recede to effort to make a change and to understanding sources and historical forces and thinking about how you can move, not in great leaps, but in incremental steps that can make things substantially better. The other thing about this process is that individuals can think thoughts about a better world, and they can do things to make it come about. There's a lot of luck in that and serendipity. But the fact that I went to law school with Bill Clinton was a really good thing for the peace process in Northern Ireland. It opened a channel of communication that in theory could have existed no matter what, but it certainly does help to say, hi, Bill, how are you? Want to help you run for president, and by the way, there's something I'd like to talk about for Northern Ireland. And with respect to that, to be able to say, oh, by the way, I just passed an immigration bill, which includes something called Morrison visas that everybody in Ireland has heard of, and you won't think about this, the defeated gubernatorial candidate, as you're the presidential candidate, but you might say that you're a friend of mine in an Irish crowd, and you'll get a little applause. And all of that was true. But that was, that's obviously the door opener. The question is, what's the sell? What is it that you're asking someone to do? And Bill Clinton, is somebody who, if you know anything about him, is a sponge for information and for perspective, and he's a master of political analysis and analysis in general. He knew about Northern Ireland because he was a Rhodes Scholar in Britain during the civil rights movement of the Irish Northern Ireland civil rights movement in the late 60s. He knew about this, but he hadn't thought about it much as a politician running for office in Arkansas. He thought a lot about it when he heard there were 40 million Irish Americans and he was running for president. In fact, Chelsea Clinton, when asked by Bill Clinton about her thesis, which was on the Northern Ireland peace process, what she thought of his performance, she said, you did well, Dad. I think at first you were just looking at those 40 million Irish American votes. But once you got into it, you really got into it and got committed and really did one heck of a job. So that's really the story of what happened. The basis of how it happened was that he made promises. He was encouraged to make those promises by those of us who thought that we had a strategy. Many American politicians had made similar promises. The difference is that these promises became policy. And they became policy because people who worked in the administration and those of us who worked outside the administration. But we always knew that if you want a politician to deliver on his or her promises, you better be there both to prod and to praise. You better understand that there are a lot of things going on in any politician's life, and if you want something to take priority, you've got to give a reason, and those reasons have to be thought through. And that's really what happened in the Clinton administration. And Bill Clinton took on the idea of taking risks for peace. When he started, the entire formal government was against what he was doing. It was only people in the White House. The State Department, the Justice Department, the FBI, they were all against an Adams visa. They were all against anything other than ask the British what they want. And the fact is that Bill Clinton stepped aside from that and decided that the peace process was worth the risk, and he would take it. And as somebody who encouraged him to take the risk, the day that the IRA declared its cessation in 1994 was a super high point, because it really said, hey, we said something could happen, and it happened. The day of the Canary Wharf bombing in February of 1996 was like the ultimate low point, because the question was, has all we've worked for been blown up? And the truth is that at that moment, people in the Clinton administration didn't shrink from their commitment and carried through, carried on, and got to the day when George Mitchell could do his magic in the Good Friday negotiations, and in which Tony Blair could be elected as prime minister, who, from the British side, completely changed the nature of the negotiations. And frankly, in these days, doesn't get nearly enough credit for what he contributed in a way that no British prime minister in the entire 800 years of the history of Britain and Ireland, what Tony Blair did. So politicians, at the end of the day, stepped up to the plate and did the deed.
Thank you. Penn puts a lot of emphasis on your read of people who can help in the situation, and particularly your read of Clinton as one who can make something happen that hasn't happened before, and of Jerry Adams being a politician, not an apologist for the IRA. Can you say something about your reading of personalities and how important that is to carrying out negotiations?
Well, I got a few of them right, I will say, in this context. I don't know if I have anything special in that regard, but one of the things, I was not born to be a political candidate. I didn't train to be a political candidate. Nobody in my family had ever run for office. I didn't think it was really possible for somebody who was too strong-willed and strong opinion to be actually elected. But what I found out as a candidate for office was that people will respect you and listen to you if you listen to them. And that if you empathize with where they're coming from, whether you agree with it or not, and you show respect for where they're coming from, you'll have some credibility to move people and to get people to be open to things being different from the way they are. So that experience of running for office for the first time in 1982 and being elected to Congress and reelected and having to campaign, and even the bitter experience of running for governor, was all about knowing that, like your mother always told you, you have 2 ears and 1 mouth. And I don't always remember that. But the point is that if there's a way to learn about where people are coming from, it is not to prejudge them and to listen to how they present themselves. And my first meeting with Jerry Adams in 1987, and I was a member of Congress. Members of Congress were not supposed to meet with Sinn Féin. And the consul general in Belfast said, "Don't tell me where you go in those black taxis." And I met with a loyalist leader and Jerry Adams within an hour of each other in the same part, more or less, of West Belfast, and they both said the same thing. They both blamed the British. So there was commonality right there, even though they didn't agree, they didn't think, but they did. And what was interesting, anybody who knows Jerry Adams knows that he's a very deep thinker and has had broad view of the history of Ireland and other things. And when I first met him, it was clear that he was a politician. He may have been whatever he may have been with the IRA, but that wasn't what defined him. What defined him was political vision. 1986, the split between Sinn Féin and Republican Sinn Féin that created the political program that became Sinn Féin's electoral success over time. That was the work of a politician and a political leader. And certainly Martin McGuinness falls into the same category. In fact, a more gifted politician perhaps than Jerry even. So those things, I didn't intuit that, they presented that. And I think that's the key to notice it, as opposed to being particularly intuitive about it.
Good. Penn, one of the things you comment on, and I'd like you both to comment on this, is that one of the things that made possible progress in the agreement was Bruce's discovery when he met with the, was it the Ulster Volunteer Force, UFV? UVF, yeah. That there was a real cleft between the people at the base, the working class people at the base, and the leaders. And the same was true on the other side. And that you know, what's worrisome is that that's what we experienced here in 2016. But can you say something about how that opened up possibilities of change? Take it first, and then Bruce can comment.
I'll speak about. I did read some about that. In your book about forgiveness, much point is made about the importance of seeing the humanity of the other, and the way back from a horrible conflict is to connect with that again. And I know Bruce had many experiences over there, but key among them was, for example, sitting in a room with loyalist paramilitaries, meeting in secret, and discovering that they were people you could relate to. They had fears and complaints and grievances and histories that you really could relate to. And as he said, as I write in the book, that he could close his eyes, and is he listening to a Republican, or is he listening to a Unionist? The grievances were in substance the same, but the names were switched. And it also had resonances, and this connected very much with Bill Clinton, of the situation in the South in the United States. As many of you probably know, the Irish in Northern Ireland were inspired by our civil rights revolution, and they tried that tack. The British served notice that they weren't going to listen to that stuff, not parades, not banners. They needed, in effect, they taught that guns and bombs might get their attention, but nothing less. So that's what they got. But in any event, it was the people, the ability to connect with and empathize for and understand the grievances was really key. And he had repeated experiences like that I read about in the book, and that was very important.
Well, the first experience of going as an American to Northern Ireland is the expectation that you're green, that you're about, a united Ireland, and that you're on behalf of an Irish American community that's Catholic, even though half of Irish America is Protestant, and that you don't have any truck with unionism or with unionists. And really, in the United States, you really couldn't come by much else as far as points of view, because that is the point of view that's expressed in the organized Irish American community. So the hardest thing that we had to do in the early days of the deniable Envoy kind of process that we conducted was to get even to talk to unionists or loyalists, because it would be an unpopular thing for them to do, a questionable thing to do. There's a guy named Jackie Redpath, who is a community organizer in the Shankill, the Protestant area of West Belfast. And Jackie really is the one who set up this meeting that Penn described, with killers, literally killers, people who had been in prison for murder from the loyalist community. They didn't talk about that. What they talked about were two things. One, they talked about being used by the unionist leadership. They call themselves cannon fodder, sent out to fight and die and be disowned for being terrorists. And they talked about Catholic ascendancy, the idea that the Catholic community, or the nationalist community if you prefer, was gaining strength and had self-confidence, and that the people they represented were at sea as to what their future might be. They were used to being on top, and now not so much. There's things that we can learn in this country about those kind of trends, and it's not about judging the people as to whether they should feel that way. It's recognizing that they do feel that way and then responding to that. And that was dramatic. I mean, there was no meeting more important to what we were able to do than hearing those words and understanding that we weren't dealing with just people on top, sure that they were going to oppress the people below them. What we're talking about were communities in change and having to figure out how they could make a new accommodation for the future where they could have one community instead of two.
If I can add just
Sure.
one thing, it not only opened it out for the American endeavor, that meeting, but it also opened it out for the Unionists and the Loyalists. Billy Hutchinson, one of the convicted killers in the meeting, said he talked about how Bruce listened with respect, how his body language said he wanted to hear their point of view and was listening with great respect. And Billy said that was the meeting that cracked it for us. And everything changed.
That was a lesson we really learned a lot in Bosnia-Herzegovina, that the victims, the people from both sides, had to hear the stories of the other side as victims before you could have reconciliation. That's really interesting. You sketch out how Bruce designed the strategy that moved the process along. Can you talk about that strategy and maybe the style too, because I think the style has a lot to do with how the strategy went, and then Bruce can fill it in some more.
Sure. Bruce had devised a strategy, a comprehensive strategy for the American role that, if luck was with them, would play out over a series of years, as it did. This strategy was never written down. I talk about it in my book, but it was something that he devised and followed, and many of the elements of it we've talked about. But the essence of it was to be well informed about what was happening there, not to be the politician who goes with a pure green agenda and really not much understanding or empathy for anybody else involved, but rather to really master the entire situation. The Northern Irish press had real sport over the years in kind of showing the lack of depth of the understanding and knowledge of American politicians pontificating about what they were doing wrong over there when they would visit. One of the great encounters was Congressman Joe Kennedy going over there and seeing British soldiers and shouting, "You should go home." And they shouted back at him, "You go home." But this really so that was the strategy, though, was a political strategy. The recognition was that if a president was willing to change the American policy, which was always deferential to Britain, that was 200 years old. That was the deal. Our best ally said, it's an internal British matter, and we accepted that. So it was basically Britain all the way up until this seat change that Morrison and others helped Bill Clinton bring about. But was also the recognition that for a president to really engage in this, you had to create conditions where he would want to do it, where he would make it his own. This is, as Bruce says in my book, that this isn't marionette style, just moving this president around and making him do what you want. This is creating political conditions where he can take these risks for peace, where he can do the things Bill Clinton ultimately was willing to do, and make the process his own and get all the credit. Bruce was savvy enough as a politician to know the credit has got to go to the president if you want the right outcome here. And then there was also the recognition, an important part of the strategy was, of course, to keep Irish America together. Right before the election, he wrote an important letter, even though at that point, with our electoral college, the Irish American vote was not going to be a significant factor in the outcome of the election, and Clinton was looking good. But he insisted, because he needed Irish America to know that Bill Clinton really meant the promises he made about Jerry Adams, about a peace envoy, and so on, that he meant it. So to be saying it in a context not of, I desperately need to win the New York primary, but I really believe this stuff, was very important. Another key element to the strategy was was to remember the importance of saying thank you. Politicians often work very hard to do things for constituents or do things in furtherance of policy that they support, and the answer is often, well, you didn't get it quite right, or what next, or something like that, and that it was very important, certainly with Bill Clinton, to say thank you, and to make sure they felt appreciated. Those were really key elements. There are others, but that
Bruce,
covers
you
it.
want to add that?
Well, I want to, you know, the strategy really started with a meeting that Neil O'Dowd, the publisher of the Irish Voice, Irish Central, and Irish America, and I had. So Neil gets at least 50%, maybe more, of the credit for the beginning of the strategy. And our strategy had one thing in it that was quite outlandish at the time, and that is that Bill Clinton was going to be elected president. It sounds like, of course, right? Like these things, once they've happened, they are easy to discern that they always were going to happen. But you have to remember that George H.W. Bush, after the Gulf War, was, the most popular president ever, with 90% approval ratings, and, looked like he was unbeatable, and maybe that was a great thing for Bill Clinton, because a lot of other candidates who might have competed for the Democratic nomination stayed away. But in any case, we banked on that. That was a gamble. That was our gamble. And if that hadn't come true, none of this would have worked out the way it worked out. So, we didn't make that happen, although we tried to help in terms of political organizing during the campaign. But our idea was that we would lay the groundwork with a candidate we thought would be open and persuadable and effective at making these changes. And Neil was the first person to say to me, didn't you go to law school with Bill Clinton? Can't we do something with that? And he deserves not only the credit for asking the question, but having a lot of ideas about what we could do.
One of the problems, at least I confronted frequently, is how do you deal with the White House staff? How do you get your messages through the White House staff? I remember once I was the intermediary between the Holy See and the White House and the State Department at the time of the Cairo Conference on Population. And it was a delicate kind of position, but there was an important question the Vatican had, and I couldn't get a response from the White House. And so after that, I learned you go in every door you can. And that became my strategy. You call everybody you know, and eventually it gets discussed. But your frenemy at the White House, if I can call her that, was Nancy Soderberg, the Deputy National Security Advisor. That is, that she was skeptical of the proposal and gradually became a friend and an advocate for the. Can you talk about your relationship with Nancy Soderberg?
Yes, I certainly can. And I don't think I'd ever use frenemy to describe Nancy. I would just use friend because regardless of whether she believed in what maybe she started thinking was a fairy tale, she listened throughout the process. Nancy's initial political home was in Ted Kennedy's office, and Ted Kennedy was the biggest promoter of John Hume in America, for good reason, because John Hume had been talking about peace and how to achieve it in Northern Ireland from the 60s, and had cautioned Ted, among others, to be careful about inflammatory rhetoric about a united Ireland, et cetera. And Ted came to respect John's opinion almost to the exclusion of any other. So if you were a staff person for Ted Kennedy, your starting point was, what does John say? And that wasn't a bad guide, but actually Americans didn't really know what John was doing, because in the late 80s, John was meeting with Jerry Adams. So while the sort of in America there was this split, there were the people who were for the Republicans, and there were people for the nationalists, and there was John's people and there were Jerry's people. Actually, John and Jerry were talking, and they were figuring out how they could collaborate on a peace process. So that comes out later, and maybe isn't as well known by everybody as it could have been. Nancy moved over to the Clinton campaign in about June of 1992. We'd been working since late of 1991, and most particularly in early 92, causing Clinton to make his famous promises about a peace envoy and a visa for Jerry Adams, et cetera. And what Nancy has said, I don't know if she says it in this book or not, but Nancy has said, if I'd got there earlier, you never had got those promises.
It's in the book.
And so she was playing catch up, and she thought that Clinton had taken risks beyond what maybe he should have. And she was very resistant when that letter that Penn, I was asking for the letter on October 23rd, and she said, this is going to make the British crazy, and he's going to be president in a week. Why are we doing this? And I said, because it's part of the plan. I got to do this. You can't back off from these promises. In the White House, she is the person who made it happen. She, yes, was skeptical. She was very skeptical about the first trip of what came to be called the Connolly House Group, but was a group of 5 Americans who went and met with everybody and tried to make things happen. When we went the first time, there was an unofficial Ira ceasefire. That was their signal that they wanted to do a deal. They wanted to change the situation. They wanted to stop the violence and replace it with politics in a real way. And she didn't believe that it would ever happen, but when it did happen, it really made a difference. She saw that we were serious, yes, but also that other people were taking us seriously, most particularly the IRA. And that was a real breakthrough. She was very open to communication, and she communicated very, very openly with me and with Neil and with others working on this process. So we were lucky, because we had somebody who actually knew the subject matter, who was a skeptic at the start, which meant that when she saw the opportunity, she was that much more committed because she had gone through the learning process. And she's a key to the fact that after Canary Wharf, the administration didn't walk away. She really kept them focused, kept the president focused on we've come this far, and this isn't the end. This is a bump in the road. We can get past this.
A little commercial break. Nancy Soderberg's running for Congress in Florida, St. Augustine. Any friends there, tell them she's really great.
Before we go to the audience, talk about handling the difficult moments like Canary Wharf. Or my heart was in my throat when I was reading the story about the cessation and the fact that the cessation hadn't been communicated to the whole IRA. It was kind of communicated by the leadership, and you didn't know whether it was going to hold or not because it wasn't thoroughly within the organization. But can you talk about just handling some of those difficult, worrisome moments where everything could have gone down?
Well, you know, when you look back on something, you say, of course. You know, of course that's the way it was going to happen. There's, you know, everything that breaks one way or another has already broken, and so you take it on board. You think about it that way. The big lesson about all of this is could have gone wrong at any point. People had to do the right thing, had to take risks. That makes a difference if you're interested in public affairs or interested in progress, that every day won't be sunny. And if you let that deter you, you know, you'll be knocked off. The worst thing that actually happened, the Adams visa took place in January of 1994, the second year of the presidency. There had been 2 Adams visa turndowns that had occurred because people had asked for a visa for stupid reasons and not thought through and not part of our plan. And it was very upsetting. And we had to engineer the situation where the president would want to say yes. But the visa decision was made. And then we waited for action. And now, if you think about it, January to August, that's no time in historical time. At the time, it seemed like at least a century passed while we were waiting for the other shoe to drop and where things are going on. And I think maybe over the 20 years, people have become used to the pace at which decisions get made in Northern Ireland, and by Republicans in particular, when they're having to go from here to there and they have to check all the boxes that they do that. But during that waiting period, there was an expectation that something was going to happen, and there was a big conference of Sinn Féin that was supposed to bless it, and it was essentially voted down. Not in a formal way, but no, they weren't ready. And that really happened in July, and we had all primed, and we had a trip over there and talked about how all this was going to come to pass, and then it's gone. And the question is, will it come again until August, when we were summoned again to be told it's going to happen? And so there were a lot of those ups and downs that sort of fade away, except when you're reminded of them now. What we had most of all throughout the process was believing the people that we talked to, both the president, the White House people, and the people on the ground in the North, and the Irish government, that people were all in. I mean, this wasn't something where people were just playing games. People were all in that they wanted something to happen, positive. They had their terms and conditions, and some people never got there, like the DUP never got there to sign up to the Good Friday Agreement. And, you know, David Trimble went and got the Nobel Prize and came home a pariah in his community because many people said he was a sellout. So it wasn't all sweetness and light, and it still isn't. But the point is that major actors in this process weren't deterred by setbacks. And, you know, I think that's unusual. I think we're often just thrown off course by setbacks.
Okay. Penn, I'd rather, if you'd indulge me, I think it's time to go to the audience. Okay. So we'll take questions from the audience now. We're here.
First, I'd like to thank all of you. I'm sure I speak for everybody here in saying this has been an incredibly fascinating conversation. And speaking for myself, I could ask questions that would go on for hours. But I have one question for you. It's kind of a two-parter. One is, are there any generalizations you could make for a peace process, not just in Ireland, but elsewhere, any sort of lessons learned that could be distilled out of this? And the second part of that is sort of applying those ideas to the Middle East situation. President Clinton devoted a lot of time not only to the Irish situation, but to the Middle East, to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. He was successful in bringing about an agreement in Ireland, but he didn't have that kind of success in the Middle East. And my question is, I guess, as you think about those lessons that could be learned from the Irish situation, how would those apply in the Middle East to the Israeli-Palestinian situation? And why was Clinton successful on the one hand in Ireland and not successful with respect to the Israeli-Palestinian situation?
One place that he most directly applied the immediate learning of the Irish process was actually in Kosovo, right after the Good Friday Agreement, where he actually did apply and get, I mean, Kosovo is another place that's far from perfect at the moment, but the fact that there was a settlement in Kosovo, and you would have said a few years earlier that they would never agree to the partition of Serbia and what led to the independence of Kosovo. So he did, you know, he actively applied it. And I, at various times, have been in conferences about the Middle East and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and, you know, suggested that maybe something could be learned from Northern Ireland. And I mostly get told to mind my business and go somewhere else, and I don't know what I'm talking about because things are different, because the stakes are different, the people are just different. There's no magic formula that comes out of what was done. There are a lot of things that make Ireland easier for Americans to negotiate because there's so much shared history and culture on both sides or all sides with respect to Ireland and to Northern Ireland, which isn't true most other places in the world. So, I mean, that was an argument from our perspective of why that's a great place to start. It's a place where you know an awful lot of what's motivating people, and you may not know that everywhere. At the end of the day, there's two things that I find lacking as we approach other places. Usually, we just can't stop ourselves from deciding who's right and who's wrong, who's got justice on their side and who is a terrorist. You can't make peace if you decide that somebody has to take the blame. You have to let everybody take the blame and everybody take the credit. And that's, I don't blame Bill Clinton for not getting there. I don't know, we haven't got there with respect to Israel and Palestine. I don't know when we will. I think there have been many missed opportunities where we didn't let people, well, in particular, where we didn't give Hamas a choice as to whether or not they wanted to do politics or they wanted to do violence after they won the election. Yeah. And we immediately sort of said all the things that they weren't going to get because they were terrorists. So to me, that's a mistake. I mean, and I think the learning is if you want to, you know, this is tribalism in one form or another everywhere in the world, and there's no tribe that can be the other. And we tend in many of these things to just be too far down the road of being on one side or the other. And maybe it's not for us. Maybe it's not for America because we just can't get out of the sort of superpower behaviors that have gone on for so long.
I want to add that I think a very important element in Ireland that did exist was, as I said earlier, a very substantial constituency for we can't live like this, something has to be done. And for many people in Northern Ireland, that transcended all the ideological positions, all the religious positions. And that was important here. Can you do it without it or with not enough of it, or can you help stoke it? Hard to say, but it existed in Northern Ireland and it was very, very helpful.
Here? Yes. Professor Chilson.
Good afternoon. Thank you so very much. So you referred to tribalism at one point, and I wonder if I could ask about those other tribes, religions, and ask what you believe was the role of faith communities in the North and faith communities in the Republic on both sides, Protestant and Roman Catholic faith communities, organized and unorganized.
First, the individual religious leaders or practitioners, whatever you want to. I mean, the organized religions don't get a lot of points for this process over time. The polarization is substantial, and there's lots of interests that attach to the organized religious bodies. You could ask the question right now of how the Catholic Church in Northern Ireland feels about integrated education, if you want to get a taste of conflicts of interest. So it was more individual priests and ministers who stepped out from their institutional roles and became conciliators, mediators across the divide. I mean, Catholics who were talking to Protestants and Protestants who were talking to Catholics. And it would be a mistake to believe that for most of the people in Northern Ireland this had anything to do with religious practice or what church you did or didn't go to. That's just that's a description of a community of which you're a part, a culture of which you're a part, a tribe of which you're a part, but it isn't about doctrine. This isn't the Reformation. This is about communities that have grown up and they have power or they don't have power, and you fly this flag. And certainly somebody like Ian Paisley Sr., used religious language and denounced the Pope and did all kinds of things that were religiously offensive because it stoked the tribalism. But for most people, it wasn't in that sense about their religion. And in fact, it's an example of the use of religion that seems irreligious for either community to be, hate, as I understand it, is not, a tenet of Christianity. And we have two Christian communities hating each other in various ways. So obviously something's gone awry here. So it's not about religion. It's about, and I think it's important for people to get past the symbols, whatever it is, wherever it is in the world, get by the symbol where people are using things that people think are part of their identity, using it as if it were about that thing rather than about the identity because you can't get by it if you're going to require that people convert in order to make peace. You can only get by it if people can accommodate the other. And if some things are absolute in the world, and so if you say this is about that, then you never get anywhere.
Let me just say a word about what the U.S. Catholic bishops and the Presbyterian Church USA did in the Interchurch Committee. One of the things we did was to have the Rev tours. We'd have a minister and a priest come and tour around. And eventually it came to two archbishops, Cathal Daly, the last great writer of Edwardian English in the West, who was Archbishop of Armagh, and Archbishop Ames, who's the Anglican Archbishop in Dublin. And they came, and that then evolved into a series of apologies that they would lead. After crises or before crises, they began a process and the Archbishop of Canterbury, they went back and forth. And John Allardyce, who was a moderate Protestant leader, came to visit us one time and said, "Drew, whatever you do, keep those apologies coming, because that's the best thing that's coming. It's the best thing that happened before the Good Friday Agreement. But we did some other concrete things. We helped with equal employment evaluation, first kind of just generally socially, and then we helped prepare British civil servants, talk about church and state, but British civil servants kind of learn how to evaluate human rights violations and so on and so forth, so that they could function properly in that role. We got involved then directly in investment, with the churches beginning to do some investments and then opening up investments to create jobs and so on. So we did a variety of things, but it was a short window before the Good Friday Agreement, because the Irish bishops didn't give their assent until Daly had become Archbishop of Armagh. Back there, with the beard, yeah.
Thank you. I just wanted to thank you both. It was a great book. Also, wanted to ask what your thoughts, both of you, would be about what's going on currently in Northern Ireland at Brexit and the possible reintroduction of a hard border and things like that. If you could speak to that, if you had any thoughts on that.
Okay. I think that thinking about the future is one of the things that should most come out of these recollections of the 20th anniversary. And I think the future is challenging. Everybody's talking about Brexit and the hard border. People like me keep waiting for the British to decide they should revote this and get out of their self-destructive process that they're engaged in, and that would be the best solution for Brexit. It's Nexit, I guess. And I think the border is demonstrating that something very special has happened that was agreed to, but not in any concrete way, but a process that would allow the economic and social integration of the island of Ireland without requiring anybody to make any political concessions. And that's been very powerful, and that's really what's threatened by the hard border. It's not no political change involved. I mean, it's always been two sovereignties. And the fact that they're in Europe is important, but it's not the key. The key is that this dynamic has gone on, and people have stopped fighting over where the cows were, that the milk they're drinking, came from. And that's the future, though, I think, has to take account of, beyond Brexit, the problem internally in Northern Ireland, that is the breakdown of Stormont. And my own opinion is that the structure that came out of the Good Friday Agreement, which was absolutely essential in 1998, is an impediment in the longer term. It is a sectarian structure. That is, if you're a politician in Northern Ireland, you don't care about the other community because you get no votes, and you do not run for votes in the other community. It's a contest, it's a demographic contest where you can talk about your community growing or shrinking and you're going to win, but all of that has to do with just, in American context, it's all base vote and no persuasion. And in a world of no persuasion, who can imagine a future that works? I mean, whether it's part of a united Ireland or whether it remains part of Britain, it's a place which is divided structurally so people's tribalism is reinforced every time they vote. Somehow we have to, now that the populations are virtually equal in terms of historic tribes, it should be possible to create a system where you don't divide up the local government along sectarian lines, and people actually have an incentive to creep into the other community and look for votes, and to have policies that are about more than, people do have policies that are about more than, the constitutional question, so-called, but it isn't really how people vote. People vote on, there are, the Unionists are not voting for Sinn Féin Sinn Féin voters are not voting DUP or UUP or even Alliance. So that's, to me, the biggest challenge, and it has to do with this is a segregated society that is still being reinforced by housing, education, and politics. That's the next great frontier for the next 20 years of changing those things. And there are powerful institutional forces, many of them thinking of themselves as benign, which resist those changes. So whoever would like to take that on, good luck. But I think it has to happen.
One of the points Bruce made that I talk about in the book is that vigorous politics got us this far, and more is needed. The Loyalist community just doesn't have an equivalently strong urban working class party like Sinn Féin, and that's a terrible loss. They need a strong political voice to hash things out more effectively and not have to constantly turn to Britain. So hopefully, the answer is more politics and more good politics. And it may take that long. As to Brexit, I have several thoughts on that, but the quick one is I would really like to see, I would fantasize that somebody like Theresa May would say, gee, maybe we don't want Brexit to be the second Cambridge Analytica pelt on their board along with the US election, and maybe we ought to rethink it, whatever. But it's a terrible idea.
I want to thank you both. This has been wonderful, and thanks to you all in the audience.